Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
My birthday dinner had that uneasy warmth that family's perfect over decades of repetition. The same supermarket tulips in a chipped vase, the same jokes rehearsed like a yearly play, and the same hierarchy, unspoken but rigid. My father sat at the head of the table, carving the roast like it was an award ceremony, while my mother darted between the kitchen and the plates, pretending she wasn't listening for cues to laugh. My sister, Emily, had arrived late, in a white blazer and perfume that cost more than my rent, already performing her role as the golden child. And me, 34 years old, steady job, no kids, single by choice, or at least that's what I told them. I was just background music in my own celebration. Dinner started as it always did, with polite small talk masquerading as affection. Dad asked Emily about her projects in that tone that suggested she was solving world hunger, and she replied with that polished vagueness she'd perfected. "It's been crazy at work. You know how it is." I did know how it was, because 2 months earlier, my boss had shown me her resume, submitted through the company portal, rejected by HR before he even saw it. I said nothing then. Family peace was expensive, and silence was the price I'd been paying for years. When Dad raised his glass and said, "To my daughter, the one who made us proud," it was almost comforting in its predictability. The table laughed, like they always did. Even my aunt joined in from the corner, her mouth full of salad. My mother smiled, that nervous smile she used when she knew something wasn't kind, but couldn't risk interrupting the mood. I looked down at my plate, and for a second, I thought maybe I could just let it slide again, let the laughter wash over me like background noise. But then Evan, my boss, sitting 2 seats away because my mother had insisted on inviting him, he's such a good mentor, dear, raised his eyebrows and said in that calm, thoughtful way of his, "That's odd, because she's been begging for a job at my office." The words didn't land like an explosion. They landed like a knife gently set on the table. The laughter died mid-breath. My mother froze halfway to the kitchen door. My father blinked once, twice, as if he'd missed the setup of a joke. And Emily, perfect, untouchable Emily, went silent. Her hand was still wrapped around her wine glass, and her knuckles were white. The light from the chandelier caught the rim of her glass, throwing a reflection across her face that made her look almost ghostly. For a moment, nobody moved. You could hear the hum of the fridge in the next room. I didn't look at her. I looked at my father instead. "That's interesting," I said, keeping my voice even, almost curious. I didn't know she was looking for something new. I could feel Emily's glare like heat on the side of my face, but I kept my eyes on the roast. If I looked at her, I might laugh, and that would have ruined everything. Dad coughed, clearing his throat like he could erase sound with air. "Well, maybe it's a misunderstanding," he said. "She's been doing great at her firm." His words hung there, desperate for belief. Evan, bless his oblivious timing, just smiled politely. "Oh, maybe," he said. "It just surprised me. She was quite persistent. Said she knew you well." The words were kind, but the implication wasn't. My father's jaw tightened. My mother reached for her napkin and began folding it into a triangle, over and over. Emily finally spoke, her voice too high, too thin. "That must have been a different Emily. There are a lot of us." Her laugh sounded rehearsed, like a soundbite from a reality show. Evan nodded, offering her an easy out. "Maybe so," he said, and turned back to his plate, mercifully changing the subject. But the silence that followed wasn't normal silence. It was charged, brittle, ready to shatter if anyone exhaled too loudly. When dessert came, no one touched it. The cake, white frosting, pink letters spelling, "Happy Birthday, Lily," looked like something from a child's party. My father tried to rally, asking me about my promotion. My mother complimented the frosting. Emily pretended to scroll through her phone, smiling at nothing. But then her phone buzzed again, and the name that flashed across the screen was unmistakable: Evan Lawson. It was quick, just a flash, but I saw it. So did he. She turned the phone face down, her lips parting slightly, a microsecond too late to fake composure. And in that single motion, something inside me finally unclenched. For years, I'd swallowed the mockery, the quiet dismissal, the invisible ledger where my achievements never counted. I'd played the safe daughter, the reasonable one. But not anymore. Not tonight. I leaned back in my chair, smiling just enough for my father to mistake it for grace. "Thanks for dinner," I said. "It's been memorable." The line was simple, but the look my sister gave me said she understood exactly what I meant. The balance had shifted. For once, I wasn't the one exposed. When I got home later, I found an unread message request on LinkedIn from someone in HR at my company. The note said, "Hi Lily, your sister Emily reached out again. Just wanted to confirm if you're referring her." I didn't reply. Not yet. Some truths deserve time to ripen before you serve them cold. The night after my birthday dinner unspoled like one of those long highway drives where the town lights smear into a ribbon and you suddenly realize you have been holding your breath for miles. Because what began as a tacky joke and a sheet cake ended as a small earthquake whose aftershocks followed me into my apartment, into my shower, into my bed, where I lay awake replaying the split second when Emily turned her phone face down and Evan's eyes flickered with the startled recognition of a man who just caught his own name in someone else's hand, and I found myself sifting through an old cabinet of moments that I usually keep locked, little scenes where the ground had tilted in her favor and I had steadied the furniture without complaint. In high school, she learned that teachers love a bright smile attached to late assignments, and our mother, eager to keep the peace, taught me to file her extension slips alongside my own neatly completed work. Later, when she freelanced for a year. That stretched into several. My father bragged about her consulting, a word that in our house covered everything from a sponsored post for protein powder to a photo shoot where she stood in front of a leased car and wrote about manifesting success. And whenever I tried to name the difference between image and reality, my parents called me uncharitable, as if accuracy were a moral failing rather than a basic courtesy to the truth. By morning, I had a small pile of receipts, not the paper kind, but the quieter kind that lives in your inbox and your memory. The LinkedIn message from HR that had arrived on my birthday like a party favor I hadn't asked for. The older email from a recruiter who said my sister had used my name in a subject line, which I'd ignored at the time because I was tired and conflict-averse, and because part of me still believed that if I kept my head down and did the unglamorous work, merit would eventually ring the bell, call my name, and hand me the little ribbon that says enough. I made coffee and reread them, then opened our family group chat, a polite museum of holiday photos, recipe swaps, and my father's links to inspirational videos about winners who never quit, and I typed a message that tasted like citrus, bright and clean. Not cruel, but undeniably sharp. Morning, family. Quick housekeeping note from work. Our company policy doesn't allow employee relatives to solicit referrals directly through hiring managers or HR. If someone wants to apply, they should use the public portal, follow the posted requirements, and avoid name-dropping staff. Sharing this here so no one runs into an awkward situation. Beneath the text, I attached a screenshot of the neutral HR policy page. No comment, no sarcasm, just the rule itself shining like a fluorescent light in a room that had been dim on purpose. The read receipts slid in a little parade, Mom first, because she always has her phone, then Dad, then my aunt, then the two cousins who never speak but always watch, yet for a full minute there was only silence. No heart emojis, no thumbs up. No gentle attempts to change the subject, and just when I wondered if the ground had swallowed the whole chat, my mother summoned a brittle cheerfulness and wrote, "Good to know. Policies matter," followed by cake and coffee icons that looked, in context, like a hostage note baked in frosting. My father waited another heartbeat before chiming in with, "Of course, rules are important," which sounded like a principal trying to remember which student had started the food fight. Emily did not respond, and I told myself I did not care, although I did what everyone does when they claim indifference in the smartphone era. I checked her social media, where a new story had bloomed like a defensive flower. A boomerang video of her sipping an iced latte, captioned with a quote about jealousy being loud and growth being silent, and although it was vague enough to pass as general wisdom, the timing gave it a neon border that said, "This is for you, Lily." And also for anyone who ever believed I was anything less than luminous. At lunch, Evan stopped at my desk with the faintly apologetic smile of a man who accidentally walked into the wrong restroom, and he said that he hoped he hadn't crossed a line the night before, that he had no intention of embarrassing anyone, that he had simply been surprised by the dissonance between the public narrative and the private inbox, and while the old me might have comforted him, brushed it off, and volunteered to do the emotional labor of smoothing a surface I did not scuff. The version of me who had slept with her eyes open smiled once and told him he had not crossed any line at all, that lines are for people who like to draw and redraw boundaries without ever stepping over them, and that, for what it's worth, my family had been due for a little honest airflow. He nodded in relief, and then, because he is decent and practical, he asked the question that had been hovering unspoken. Did I want him to block further outreach from my sister or forward anything to HR, and was there anything he should be aware of, because he valued fairness and transparency and also his own schedule, which did not include writing polite declines to a persistent stranger who believed persistence alone could substitute for credentials. What I wanted, I realized, was not a public flogging or a brotherly rescue, because those satisfactions are loud and brief, and my family is very good at tuning out noise and waiting for storms to pass. What I wanted was a quiet realignment made visible through process, not gossip. Applications reviewed by a blind panel, resumes scored against actual requirements, interviews scheduled only if a candidate met the criteria on paper, and feedback provided in writing rather than through favors or whispers. A system so clean it squeaked. A system that would either elevate my sister on her merits or lay bare the gap between performance and skill without me ever lifting a knife. So I told Evan that if any outreach arrived, he should route it straight to HR, and that I would be grateful if all hiring, for any role, went through the published channel with a documented rubric. He agreed without hesitation. And, because he is not cruel, he added that, should my family situation become uncomfortable, I could use a comp day to breathe, which made me like him more than I wanted to admit. The revenge, if you can call it that, landed in the afternoon with the softest thud imaginable when our family chat pinged again, and I, after verifying my mother and father were both online, dropped a second message that contained nothing but a link to the same public careers page, framed with the most neutral language I could write. For convenience, here's the official application portal everyone uses. It lists required skills for each role and the review timeline, which keeps things fair. No names, no arrows, no flames, just a door and a doormat, and if Emily felt it as a slap, that was not my fault, because fairness can sting when you have been living on special arrangements. She finally replied with a single sentence about being heads down on a campaign and not looking right now, which would have been convincing if I had not received, at that exact minute, an internal notification that she had attempted to upload a new resume through an old referral link that no longer worked. Under the revised policy, I was still choosing between a laugh and a sigh when my screen blinked with a calendar invite stamped urgent, and Evan's name sat at the top with the subject line brief chat about a situation, scheduled for the next morning before coffee. The kind of meeting that rarely exists for good news, and while a younger version of me might have launched into preemptive defense or self-recrimination, I simply closed my laptop, washed my mug, and let the day end on purpose, because some storms are better met upright and dry. By the time morning arrived, the thin calm that had settled over my apartment felt like a borrowed costume I was afraid to crease. The message from Evan glowed on my phone as I dressed for work, and every ordinary action, pouring coffee, tying my hair, finding my keys, seemed threaded with a quiet tension that hummed beneath the surface of routine. I had spent years teaching myself to anticipate small disasters, the kind that start as misunderstandings and end with everyone pretending nothing happened, yet this one felt different, heavier in the air, as if the truth had finally slipped its leash and was circling the house, waiting to be let in. When I arrived at the office, the morning light fell through the tall windows like a spotlight searching for guilt. Evan's door was open, and his expression was kind but wary, the look of a man about to discuss something he wishes were none of his business. He motioned for me to sit, and when I did, he took a slow breath before speaking. Your sister, he began, his voice even but cautious, emailed again last night. He turned his screen toward me, and there it was, another message written in that unmistakable blend of charm and entitlement. She thanked him for keeping an open mind, mentioned that family dinners can be tricky, and attached a new resume that looked suspiciously familiar. In fact, it was familiar because it wasn't hers, it was mine, edited just enough to disguise the theft. My project summaries, my phrasing, even a paragraph lifted from an old presentation I had once shown her for inspiration. For a moment, the world narrowed to a pulse. Evan must have seen the color drain from my face because he added quickly, "Don't worry." I didn't respond. But HR should probably know. I nodded, feeling the weight of the years compress in my chest, the birthdays where my successes went unmentioned, the holidays where she arrived late and left early but still managed to collect all the praise, the endless practice deflections that had trained me to swallow resentment until it calcified. She's trying to prove something, I said quietly, and she doesn't care what burns in the process. Evan's voice softened. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to stir anything up. I shook my head. You didn't stir it. You just turned on the light. And that was true. He wasn't the problem. He had simply exposed what had been festering for years beneath the varnish of family harmony. That night, my sister called, her voice bright and brittle, the way it always got when she wanted something. Hey, so, about that job thing, she began, as if we were discussing a misplaced jacket. Dad thinks maybe you could help smooth it over? You know how bosses get weird about boundaries. The way she said the word made it sound decorative, like throw pillows no one actually uses. I let her talk, letting her fill the space with excuses, how she was just testing the waters, how she'd been encouraged to apply, how maybe Evan misunderstood her enthusiasm, and when she finally paused for breath, I said, "Why don't we do a mock interview? If you really want this role, let's see what you'd say." She hesitated, but pride pushed her forward. Fine. Let's do it. I scheduled a video call for that evening, and when the screen flickered to life, she appeared in perfect lighting, hair styled, smile rehearsed. I began gently, asking her about project management strategies, her experience with analytics platforms, her understanding of the company's core products. Each question peeled away a layer of polish until the performance began to tremble. Her answers stumbled into vague generalities, the vocabulary mismatched with the industry she was pretending to know. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't mock. I just listened. And when she started to realize she was drowning, I handed her the lifeline she had thrown away years ago, honesty. Emily, I said softly, you don't need to be me. You just need to be something real. Maybe start there. Her expression hardened, confusion flickering into anger. You think you're better than me, she snapped. You always have. I smiled, not cruelly, but with a kind of exhaustion that had long matured into clarity. No, I said, I just finally stopped pretending you were better than me. She ended the call without a word. The next morning, Evan stopped by my desk again, this time holding a printed copy of an email from HR. They had received a complaint, anonymous, of course, suggesting that I had discouraged a qualified candidate from applying. The language was identical to my sister's style, polished and slippery. He placed it gently on my desk. I wanted you to see it first, he said. We'll handle it, but I thought you should know. I read it twice, every line tightening my jaw a little more. There it was again, the reversal, the narrative twist she had always mastered. Victim turned accuser, fact turned feeling, responsibility turned fog. I thanked him for bringing it to me and told him I'd prepare a brief note clarifying events for HR, though inside, I was already building something else, a lesson, not loud but deliberate, that would unfold in a language she couldn't manipulate. I was tired of defending myself in whispers. I wanted to teach her, finally, what accountability sounds like when spoken calmly, precisely, and in front of witnesses. That evening, I wrote her a message, not cruel, not emotional, just a summary of our practice interview, the skills she'd claimed, the answers she'd given, and a suggestion that she seek mentorship before pursuing any future openings. I sent it to her, copied my parents, and included one final line. Since honesty seems to cause confusion, I thought it best to keep everyone informed. Then I closed my laptop, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat in the quiet that followed, not triumphant, not bitter, but alert, because I knew the next move wouldn't be hers or mine. It would be the consequence finally catching up. The meeting the next morning began with that careful politeness people adopt when they suspect a conversation will involve something flammable yet cannot be deferred without lighting a separate fire elsewhere. And as I took the chair across from Evan's desk, I felt the odd steadiness that arrives after a sleepless night, the kind where your thoughts have spun through so many possible futures that the present suddenly looks simple by comparison, which is how his first sentence. HR forwarded a complaint that appears to have come from your sister, and while the tone is artful, the substance is hollow, landed not like a blow, but like a final punctuation mark on a sentence that had been dragging on for years. He slid a folder toward me that contained printouts I already knew by rhythm, if not by paper weight, screenshots of messages, timestamps that contradicted her claims, and the brief summary of my own note to HR that documented the mock interview without leaning into humiliation, and after I scanned the pages, I closed the folder and told him what I had rehearsed on my walk to work, namely that I did not want a protective favor dressed up as justice, that I did not want a private backroom dismissal or a wink that said family is complicated, and that what I wanted instead was a process so dull and honest that it left no room for whispers to grow teeth. He listened the way good managers listen when they recognize the difference between a problem and a pattern, and when I told him exactly how to make the airfare again, post the role publicly, publish the rubric, anonymize resumes for the first pass, assign a mixed panel to score blind, deliver written feedback, and let the results arrive clean, he nodded with something like relief, not because it would be easy but because the alternative, the endless hedging around a mess we didn't make, would have been a heavier kind of labor. The plan rolled out across the morning with the quiet efficiency of a well-tuned machine, HR grateful for a chance to demonstrate integrity. The hiring coordinator gleeful in the way only a rules-loving person can be when handed a reason to color-code a spreadsheet, and Evan pragmatic about optics, because he lives in the real world where fairness must also be seen to be fair, which is how a new posting appeared on the careers page by mid-afternoon that took the oxygen out of every back channel. And although the listing did not mention my sister by name, it might as well have spoken directly to the mirror, because the requirements were simply what the job actually required, nothing more and nothing less. I sent the link to the family chat without commentary, a small act that felt less like a jab than a mirror held steady, and my mother responded with a sandwich of positivity and unease, so proud of both my hardworking girls, opportunities everywhere. Which would have been sweet if it were not a reflexive hedge, while my father stayed silent in a way that suggested calculations were occurring behind his eyes, a budget of pride being reallocated now that the market price of bragging had shifted. Emily, predictably, posted a story about loving a challenge and rising above noise, and within an hour the applicant tracking system registered her submission under a disguised email that was neither clever nor subtle. And because the resumes were anonymized, the early reviewers did exactly what they were trained to do, which is to score what was on the page rather than what someone once promised at a family barbecue. And the math did what math always does when it is permitted to breathe. It sorted with indifference. By evening, the shortlist had narrowed to a handful of candidates whose portfolios lived in the stubborn world of deliverables rather than captions. And when I checked my inbox before bed, I saw an internal note that the assessment assignment had been sent to those finalists, a tidy product exercise that measured judgment rather than confidence. And I allowed myself to imagine a future in which the lesson would arrive not as a slap, but as a mirror showing exactly what had been missing all along. The cleverness, if you want to call it revenge, lay not in any humiliation but in the architecture of the offer I made to Evan after lunch, a suggestion that we turn the assessment into something we would adopt permanently. A reusable challenge we could keep in our hiring drawer so that no one, not even a future version of me, would ever again need to persuade a manager that fairness isn't personal. And as we drafted the rubric, I felt the anger I had carried for years spread out into something Cooler and more useful, because converting fury into process is the adult version of the slam poem you avoid writing in your head, and while it lacks the immediate gratification of spectacle, it tends to survive the winter. When the assessment went out, HR set the review deadline for the day before Thanksgiving, which in any other year would have been an unremarkable scheduling convenience, yet in this year cracked open an old ache. Because my father had already announced he would host, and because he loves a holiday microphone the way some men love a remote control, I knew he would try to reinstate the old order by way of a toast if no counterweight appeared, and I could feel the tableau assembling itself in advance, turkey steaming, cousins scrolling under the table, my mother's nervous smile, and my sister, in seasonal knit and expensive lip gloss, waiting to see if the universe still tilted her way when the air got thick with gravy. The day before the deadline, as if the calendar were an accomplice with a sense of humor, my phone lit up with a message from my father that contained a draft of a speech he was workshopping, a call for family unity. Dressed in compliments that clanged like wind chimes in a storm, and although I should have ignored it, I edited the punctuation and sent it back with a simple line, maybe add something about gratitude for integrity and second chances. It plays better than winners and losers, which he read as daughterly support even though I had loaded the sentence with a fuse, because if the results arrived as cleanly as I expected, that exact phrase would become the only dignified path he could take without swallowing his own tongue. Late that night, after a quiet dinner alone that felt luxurious in its lack of performance, I opened the applicant portal one last time and saw the status flags shift from in review to scored, the top candidate highlighted in the spreadsheet with a color the coordinator always uses for unequivocal yes, and while the anonymization kept names hidden for one more day, the portfolio links were there, their timestamps stubbornly honest, and I recognized none of them as my sister's work. I slept with the kind of exhaustion that follows after a marathon you never registered for, and when I woke, the official email from HR was already waiting with a subject line that looked almost gentle: final results and next steps. And as I clicked it open, the phone began to ring with my mother's name flashing across the screen, which is how the day began, with two choices, read first or answer first, and both were heavy with a consequence I had waited my whole life to stop fearing. Thanksgiving arrived like a storm disguised as sunshine, and from the moment I stepped into my parents' house, I could feel the undercurrent vibrating beneath the surface of every polite word, every practiced smile. Every dish passed hand to hand as if civility alone could hold the tectonic plates of our family together. The table was already set in the same way it had been since childhood, my father at the head, my mother orbiting nervously, Emily strategically placed across from me so that she could monitor reactions without appearing to do so. The scent of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and something faintly metallic filled the room, an atmosphere of warmth layered over tension thick enough to chew. The new silverware glinted like armor, and for the first time in my life, I realized that even the table settings had always carried hierarchy, with my father's chair taller, my sister's plate a fraction larger, my own fork set slightly off-center, as if balance had been a design flaw from the beginning. The day before, the email from HR had confirmed what I already suspected. The highest-scoring candidate for the open position wasn't Emily or anyone connected to her. It was a woman from Colorado named Rachel, whose portfolio spoke for itself, unadorned and undeniable. Her selection was unanimous. There would be no second chances, no sympathy interviews, no carefully phrased rejection letters designed to cushion fragile pride. And yet, as I stood in that dining room, watching my father pour wine as if nothing had shifted, I realized the real reckoning would not come from a hiring decision. It would come from what people chose to say, and more importantly, what they chose not to. My father began with his usual toast, his voice steady, confident, trained from years of being the loudest in any room. Family, he said, is about showing up for each other, especially when the world outside tries to tell us what we can't do. His eyes flicked toward me with the faintest trace of reproach, the kind that lives between sentences. And tonight, he continued, I want to celebrate perseverance, especially from those who remind us that ambition runs in the blood. My mother smiled in that practiced way she reserved for peacekeeping, and Emily lifted her glass before he even finished the sentence, basking in the implied spotlight as though nothing had happened, as though the world had simply reset itself overnight. I could have let it go. I could have played the part one had perfected for years, the quiet daughter, the one who absorbs the sting and turns it into fuel for tomorrow. But I was done being the emotional landfill for everyone else's pretense. I waited until the clinking subsided, until every fork hovered over the untouched stuffing, and then I stood, glass in hand. Heart beating in that calm rhythm that comes only when a person has already rehearsed truth so many times it no longer feels like rebellion. I'd like to add something, I said. This year, I've learned a lot about fairness, how it doesn't need applause to exist, how it doesn't always look like kindness, and how sometimes it sounds like silence before the truth finally lands. My father's smile faltered, just slightly. My mother's hand froze over the serving spoon. At work, we had a job opening recently, I continued, my tone conversational, almost gentle. The process was anonymous. No names, no referrals, no family ties. Just skill, results, and integrity. The best person won. Clean and simple. I think that's something to be grateful for. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was sharp, a blade of stillness slicing through the room. My father's eyes darted to Emily, whose expression cracked into disbelief before she quickly assembled a brittle laugh. Wow, she said, someone's feeling self-righteous tonight. The words were meant to sting, but they landed hollow. Everyone at the table had seen too much. My aunt cleared her throat. My mother tried to pivot to the pie, her voice trembling. Pumpkin or pecan, she asked no one in particular, and no one answered. I didn't gloat. That was the beauty of it. Revenge that speaks softly doesn't need witnesses to echo. I sat back down, cut a small piece of turkey, and let the hum of discomfort fill the air like distant thunder. Then Evan's name appeared on my phone, an email notification lighting up quietly at the edge of the table. I opened it discreetly, reading his brief note. Offer accepted. Rachel starts Monday. She mentioned she's grateful the process was transparent. It reminded her that real merit still counts for something. The message was small, almost bureaucratic, but it felt like the cleanest vindication I'd ever received. Emily excused herself shortly after dessert, claiming a headache, her chair scraping across the floor like punctuation on a confession she refused to make. My father poured himself another drink, muttering something about how corporate games are all politics anyway, while my mother collected plates that no one had touched. I stayed until the end, helping clear the table in silence, the scent of burnt sugar and wine heavy in the air. As I washed the dishes, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window, tired, older, but finally unflinching, and for the first time, I didn't feel invisible. When I left, the night air was cold enough to sting, and the street was quiet except for the faint rustle of leaves scraping against the curb. I thought about how the story might be retold later, how my father would probably soften it, how my mother would insist it was all a misunderstanding, how Emily would spin it into another narrative where she was misunderstood rather than unmasked. But I also knew that, beneath whatever version they constructed, something irreversible had shifted. The illusion of her perfection had cracked, and in its place was a silence she couldn't control. As I reached my car, my phone buzzed once more, a message from Evan, short and unassuming. By the way, tell your family happy Thanksgiving. And tell your sister I hope she finds something that suits her better. I smiled faintly, not out of triumph but out of recognition that sometimes justice doesn't roar, it just sits quietly in the corner, certain of itself, waiting for everyone else to catch up. I drove home without music, without the usual need to rehearse what I should have said, because this time, I had said exactly enough. And as the lights of the town blurred into the dark horizon, I realized that peace doesn't always look like reconciliation. It can also look like distance, finally unburdened, finally earned.